The airfield stretched empty under the Arizona sun, heat shimmers rising from cracked tarmac like ghosts of forgotten wars. Colonel Thorne stepped from his air-conditioned sedan, adjusting his uniform against the desert wind that carried whispers of grounded dreams. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat in perfect formation, 37 aircraft that Congress had declared obsolete, their shark-toothed grins now silenced by bureaucratic decree. Mothballed, Thorne muttered, consulting his tablet. Every last Warthog. The close air support legends that had saved countless ground troops in Iraq and Afghanistan were now museum pieces, victims of budget cuts and modern warfare theory. F-35 Lightning IIs were the future, sleek, stealthy, expensive. The A-10s were relics of a different kind of war, built to fly low, slow, and ugly into the teeth of enemy fire. But something was wrong with the count. Thorne's aide, Lieutenant Morrison, approached with nervous energy. "Sir, we have a discrepancy in the inventory." "What kind of discrepancy?" "Aircraft 810965 is missing from the line. Call sign Reaper 6. According to records, it should be here." Thorne's weathered face hardened. He'd overseen the decommissioning personally. Every A-10 accounted for, every pilot reassigned or retired. The Air Force had moved on from close air support, embracing precision strikes from altitude. The era of pilots flying through flak to save Marines pinned down in valleys was over. "Check the maintenance hangars," he ordered, though something cold settled in his stomach. Reaper 6 wasn't just any aircraft. It had belonged to Major Cassandra "Viper" Reeves, the pilot who'd earned more distinguished flying crosses than any other A-10 driver in history. The woman who'd turned the aircraft into legend during the darkest days of Operation Enduring Freedom. Reeves had been forcibly retired 18 months ago after publicly challenging the A-10's retirement. The brass had painted her as a relic, unable to adapt to modern warfare. But Thorne remembered the reports from Afghanistan. Entire Taliban compounds destroyed by her 30 cannon, rescue missions flown through impossible weather, troops saved when everyone else said the mission was suicide. Morrison returned pale. "Sir, we found something. Hangar 7 has been compromised. Security footage shows unauthorized entry 6 hours ago." Thorne's blood chilled. 6 hours ago, intelligence had reported massive enemy movement in the Sinai Peninsula, Egyptian forces overwhelmed, Israeli borders threatened, American civilians trapped in a rapidly collapsing situation. The Pentagon had scrambled every available asset, but the region's anti-aircraft systems made high-altitude bombing risky. They needed something that could fly low, absorb punishment, and deliver precision death. They needed an A-10. And Major Cassandra "Viper" Reeves had just stolen one. The radio crackled in Thorne's earpiece. "Unknown A-10 aircraft, Squawk 7700, you are ordered to return to base immediately." Static answered. Then, cutting through the interference, came a voice that made grown men feel safe and enemies wet themselves with fear. "Negative control. Reaper 6 is Winchester and heading east. Some things are more important than orders." The aircraft had vanished from radar. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Major Cassandra Reeves was flying a stolen A-10 Thunderbolt II toward a war zone that officially no longer needed her kind of warfare. The woman they dismissed as obsolete was about to remind the world why the Warthog had earned its reputation in blood and thunder. But first, she had to survive the flight across an ocean in an aircraft not designed for maritime operations, with no tanker support, no backup, and no hope of return. The fuel calculations alone made it a suicide mission. Yet Reaper 6 pressed eastward, carrying 30 years of combat experience and a 30 cannon that could punch holes through main battle tanks. Behind her, Colonel Thorne stood in the empty hangar, staring at the maintenance logs that revealed the truth. Reeves hadn't just stolen an aircraft. She'd been secretly maintaining it for months, preparing for this moment. The discarded warrior had never truly accepted defeat. "Sir," Morrison whispered, "what do we tell the Pentagon?" Thorne looked at the empty hardstand where Reaper 6 had waited, its engines cold for over a year until 6 hours ago. He thought about the American civilians trapped in the Sinai, the overwhelmed Egyptian forces, the impossible tactical situation that required exactly the kind of pilot the Air Force had deemed obsolete. "We tell them," Thorne said quietly, "that Major Cassandra Reeves just declared herself operational." 12,000 feet over the Atlantic, Viper checked her fuel gauges and smiled grimly. The ocean stretched endlessly below, dark and unforgiving. Her HUD displayed calculations that confirmed what she already knew. This was a one-way trip. But somewhere ahead, in the burning sands of the Sinai Peninsula, American citizens were depending on close air support that only an A-10 could provide. She'd been born for this moment. Everything else had been preparation. The Sinai Peninsula burned under an unforgiving sun as Egyptian armored units retreated in disorder, their equipment scattered across 15 miles of desert. Major Hassan Khalil pressed the radio handset against his ear, trying to coordinate the evacuation of American archaeological teams trapped near St. Catherine's Monastery, while his own forces disintegrated around him. "All stations, this is Pyramid Base," he transmitted. "We have confirmation. Approximately 200 American civilians are trapped at grid reference 77 Alpha. Enemy armor closing from 3 directions. Request immediate air support." The reply crackled with static and frustration. "Pyramid Base, be advised no close air support available. F-35 strikes delayed due to SA-20 threats. Maintain current positions and await further instructions." Hassan closed his eyes. The Americans had sophisticated aircraft, but the enemy had flooded the region with advanced surface-to-air missiles. The stealth fighters couldn't risk low-altitude missions, and high-altitude bombing was useless with civilians mixed among the targets. They needed something that could fly low, absorb punishment, and deliver precision firepower. They needed an A-10 Warthog, but the Americans had retired them all. "Major, enemy contacts bearing 270, Sergeant Manser called out, adjusting his binoculars. T-80 main battle tanks, estimated company strength." Hassan grabbed the field glasses. Through the heat shimmer, he could see the distinctive silhouettes of modern Russian armor advancing methodically across the desert. Behind them, infantry fighting vehicles and mobile anti-aircraft systems created a steel curtain that would crush any ground resistance. His radio crackled again, this time on a frequency that wasn't supposed to exist. "Pyramid Base, this is Reaper 6. I'm inbound your position, Angels 2, requesting immediate tactical situation report." Hassan's blood froze. Every pilot in the Middle East knew that call sign. Major Cassandra "Viper" Reeves had been legend even before the Americans retired their A-10 fleet. During Operation Enduring Freedom, she'd flown missions that other pilots called impossible, bringing close air support to troops that everyone else had written off. But Reaper 6 had been grounded. The A-10 program was dead. "Reaper 6, confirm your aircraft type," Hassan transmitted, hardly daring to hope. "Pyramid Base, Reaper 6 is flying, Thunderbolt II, call sign Warthog. I'm carrying 30mm high-explosive incendiary, AGM-65 Mavericks, and approximately 18 minutes of loiter time before fuel becomes critical." Hassan felt tears sting his eyes. 18 minutes, against a reinforced armor battalion with no backup and no hope of return. The American pilot was flying a suicide mission to save people she'd never met. "Reaper 6, be advised enemy has extensive SA-20 coverage. High-altitude ingress not recommended." Static. Then, cutting through the interference, came a voice that carried 30 years of combat experience. "Pyramid Base, since when do Warthogs fly high altitude? Reaper 6 is going in low and fast. Mark your friendlies and keep your heads down." Through his binoculars, Hassan spotted the aircraft first, a gray speck approaching from the northwest, flying barely 50 feet above the desert floor. The A-10 Thunderbolt II looked exactly like its nickname suggested: ugly, ungainly, and absolutely terrifying to anyone on the receiving end of its weapons. The aircraft's twin engines screamed as Viper dropped even lower, using terrain masking to avoid radar detection. Her speed was deceptively slow, perhaps 300 knots, but that allowed precision targeting that faster jets couldn't achieve. Pyramid Base, I have visual on enemy armor. Commencing attack run from the north. Danger close, keep your people under hard cover. Hassan grabbed his radio. All units take cover, incoming friendly air support. The first T-80 tank exploded without warning. Viper's 30 GAU-8 Avenger cannon spoke with a distinctive sound, a deep, thunderous buzz that lasted exactly 2 seconds and fired 65 depleted uranium rounds. The main battle tank's turret separated from its hull in a shower of sparks and debris. Direct hit, Hassan breathed. Reaper 6, that's 1 T-80 destroyed. But the remaining enemy armor was reacting. Surface-to-air missiles streaked upward as the A-10 pulled into a climbing turn, flares streaming from its defensive countermeasures. Viper's voice remained steady despite the chaos. Pyramid Base, marking targets with smoke. I count 12 more tanks and multiple APCs. This is going to get interesting. The stolen A-10 dove back toward Earth like a mechanical angel of death. Major Cassandra Reeves had crossed an ocean to fight a war that her own government had declared beyond her capabilities. She had 18 minutes of fuel and an entire enemy battalion to destroy. The Warthog had returned to combat, and the enemy was about to remember why close air support had never truly gone out of style. The second attack run began with mathematical precision. Viper rolled the A-10 into a 30-degree dive, her targeting computer painting hostile vehicles with deadly accuracy. The GAU-8, a cannon, erupted again, this time a longer burst that turned 2 infantry fighting vehicles into burning scrap metal. Reaper 6 splashed 2 BMPs, Hassan reported, watching through his binoculars as the A-10 pulled up sharply, climbing through a barrage of small arms fire that sparked off its armored cockpit. The Thunderbolt II had been designed to absorb punishment. Its titanium bathtub could survive direct hits from 23 cannon rounds. "Copy splash," Viper replied, her voice controlled despite pulling nearly 6 GS in her climb. "Pyramid Base, I'm seeing a lot of anti-aircraft activity. They've got ZSU-23-4s mixed in with the armor." The Shilka anti-aircraft guns were deadly threats to low-flying aircraft. Their quad-barrel 23 cannons could throw up walls of steel that would shred conventional attack aircraft. But the A-10 wasn't conventional. It was a flying tank built around the most powerful aircraft cannon ever deployed. "Reaper 6, we count 4 Shilkas in your target area," Hassan warned. "Recommend high-altitude approach." Static crackled. Then Viper's laugh, dark, professional, completely without fear. "Pyramid Base, there's no such thing as high altitude in a Warthog. We're going in low." The A-10 turned toward the heaviest concentration of enemy fire. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit as Viper lined up on her next target, a ZSU-23-4 that was pumping shells toward her aircraft at 800 rounds per minute. The math was simple. Either she destroyed the anti-aircraft gun, or it would eventually hit something critical. The GAU-8, a cannon, spoke again. 65 depleted uranium rounds traveled downrange at nearly twice the speed of sound, each one capable of penetrating tank armor. The Shilka disappeared in a spectacular explosion that sent its radar dish spinning across the desert. "Direct hit," Hassan shouted. "Reaper 6, that's 1 AAA down." But Viper was already acquiring her next target. A T-80 main battle tank had positioned itself hull down behind a rocky outcrop, its 125 gun elevated toward the attacking aircraft. Tank crews had been shooting at aircraft since World War II. Sometimes they got lucky. The A-10 dove toward the tank like a mechanical falcon. At the last possible second, Viper pulled up sharply, trading altitude for an impossible firing angle. Her cannon found the T-80's thin top armor, penetrating through to the ammunition storage. The tank erupted in a pillar of flame that rose 300 feet into the desert air. "Jesus," Sergeant Manser whispered, lowering his binoculars. "She's not flying, she's conducting a symphony of destruction." Hassan nodded grimly. In 7 minutes of combat, Major Cassandra Reeves had destroyed 6 enemy vehicles and scattered an entire armored column. But her fuel state was becoming critical, and the surviving enemy forces were adapting to her attack patterns. "Reaper 6, be advised you have SA-20 launch detected," Hassan transmitted. "Missile inbound from the southeast." The surface-to-air missile was a serious threat, capable of Mach 3 speeds and designed to kill aircraft exactly like the A-10. Viper's response was immediate and professional. "Copy SAM launch. Pyramid Base, if this doesn't work out, tell my crew chief that Reaper 6 died with a clean gun." The A-10 dropped to within 20 feet of the desert floor, using terrain masking and defensive flares to confuse the incoming missile. The SA-20 detonated harmlessly against a rocky hill, its fragmentation pattern missing the Thunderbolt by mere yards. "Reaper 6 still mission capable," Viper reported, as if dodging supersonic missiles was routine maintenance. "Pyramid Base, I'm Winchester on 30 and down to 5 minutes of fuel. Request coordinates for highest value targets." Winchester meant her cannon was empty. 400 rounds of depleted uranium expended in less than 10 minutes of combat. But she still carried AGM-65 Maverick missiles, each one capable of destroying main battle tanks with surgical precision. Hassan consulted his tactical display. "Reaper 6, we have enemy command vehicle at grid 76 Charlie. High priority target with communications equipment." "Copy 76 Charlie. Reaper 6 is in hot." The final attack run was poetry in motion. Viper approached the target from an unexpected angle, using a dry riverbed to mask her approach. The enemy command vehicle, a heavily modified BTR-80 with sophisticated communications equipment, was positioned behind what its crew thought was adequate cover. The AGM-65 Maverick missile struck with pinpoint accuracy. The command vehicle vaporized instantly, taking the enemy's ability to coordinate their retreat with it. "Direct hit," Hassan confirmed. "Reaper 6, that's mission accomplished. Outstanding work." But as he spoke, he could see the climbing toward the eastern horizon, its fuel state critical and no friendly airfield within range. Major Cassandra Reeves had crossed an ocean to save American civilians trapped in the Sinai Peninsula. Now she was flying toward an uncertain fate with empty fuel tanks and no hope of return. The woman they'd called obsolete had just proved that some kinds of warfare never go out of style. The A-10's engines began their death song, a gradual reduction in power that every pilot fears. Viper watched her fuel flow indicators approach zero while scanning the horizon for anything resembling a landing strip. Behind her, the Sinai Peninsula slowly disappeared into heat haze, marked by columns of black smoke from destroyed enemy vehicles. "Pyramid Base, Reaper 6, she transmitted, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that had made her legendary. "Mission accomplished. American civilians are clear of immediate threat. I'm heading east with approximately 2 minutes of fuel remaining." Hassan's voice crackled through the static. "Reaper 6, you saved 200 lives today. There's no adequate way to express our gratitude." "Copy that, Pyramid Base. Just doing what warthogs do." The Mediterranean Sea stretched endlessly ahead, blue water that would become her final resting place unless she found an alternative. The A-10's Emergency Procedures Manual had never anticipated this scenario. A solo transoceanic flight in an aircraft designed for short-range close air support. Her radar picked up an unexpected contact bearing 090 degrees. Too small to be a ship, too slow to be an aircraft. Viper squinted through her HUD, adjusting her heading toward the mysterious signature. Aircraft calling Mayday, this is Cypress Tower. We have you on radar bearing 270 degrees, Angels 1,000 feet. State your intentions. Cyprus, the British sovereign base at Akrotiri, an RAF installation with a runway long enough for heavy transport aircraft. Viper had never been so happy to hear a British accent in her life. Cypress Tower, this is United States Air Force A-10, call sign Reaper 6. Declaring emergency, fuel critical, requesting immediate landing clearance. Long pause. She could imagine the conversation in the control tower. An A-10 Thunderbolt II that wasn't supposed to exist, flown by a pilot who should have been retired, requesting emergency landing after conducting unauthorized combat operations. Reaper 6, Cypress Tower. You are cleared for emergency landing, runway 09. Be advised we have emergency vehicles standing by. The A-10's left engine quit exactly 30 seconds before touchdown. Viper deployed the emergency power unit, maintaining hydraulic pressure for flight controls while the aircraft descended toward the runway on a single engine. The touchdown was firm but controlled, exactly the kind of landing that separated professional pilots from everyone else. Fire trucks surrounded the A-10 as it rolled to a stop, foam equipment ready for fuel fires that never materialized. British ground crew approached the aircraft with expressions of professional curiosity mixed with outright disbelief. Royal Air Force Squadron leader James Morrison was the first to reach the cockpit. He watched as Major Cassandra Reeves completed her shutdown checklist with methodical precision, then removed her helmet to reveal iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much combat. "Major," Morrison said carefully, "I'm going to need some explanation for how an American appeared over Cyprus after conducting combat operations in the Sinai Peninsula." Viper climbed down from the cockpit, her flight suit soaked with sweat and marked by the physical stress of combat flying. She looked at the British officer with the kind of smile that had terrified enemy ground troops for 30 years. "Squadron leader, that's going to require a very long conversation and probably several cups of coffee." Within hours, the story began spreading through military networks worldwide. Major Cassandra Viper Reeves had stolen a decommissioned A-10 Thunderbolt II, flown it across the Atlantic Ocean, and single-handedly broken up an enemy armored assault that threatened American civilians. The woman the Air Force had dismissed as obsolete had just delivered the most effective close air support mission of the decade. But in the back rooms of the Pentagon, a different conversation was taking place. General Patricia Hayes, Air Force Chief of Staff, studied the after-action reports with growing concern. The Sinai Peninsula incident had exposed critical gaps in America's ability to provide close air support in high-threat environments. "Colonel Thorne," she said quietly, "how many A-10s do we have in storage?" 37 aircraft, ma'am, all in mothballs at Davis-Monthan." General Hayes nodded slowly. "And how many pilots like Major Reeves are currently assigned to desk jobs or forced retirement?" The question hung in the air like smoke from burning tanks. Outside her window, F-35 Lightning IIs practiced high-altitude bombing runs, sleek, stealthy, and completely inappropriate for the kind of warfare that had just erupted in the Middle East. Major Cassandra Reeves had stolen an aircraft to prove a point. The question now was whether the United States Air Force was ready to admit she'd been right all along. The coffee was terrible, but Squadron Leader Morrison poured it anyway. Across the table in the RAF Akrotiri briefing room, Major Cassandra Reeves sat with the posture of someone who had just flown 12 hours of impossible missions and was prepared to do it again. "Let me understand this correctly," Morrison said, consulting his notes. "You stole a decommissioned aircraft from a secure facility, flew it across the Atlantic Ocean without tanker support, and conducted unauthorized combat operations in Egyptian airspace." Viper sipped her coffee and smiled. "That's a fairly accurate summary, Squadron Leader. And you did this because 200 American civilians were about to die, and the United States Air Force no longer possessed the capability to save them." Morrison leaned back in his chair. During his 20-year career with the RAF, he'd met exactly 3 pilots who could have attempted such a mission. 2 of them were dead. The third was sitting across from him, calmly explaining how she'd conducted close air support in an aircraft that officially didn't exist. "Major, my government is going to have questions." "I imagine they will. The Americans are sending a team to collect you, and presumably to collect their aircraft." Viper's expression didn't change. "The aircraft belongs to the American people, Squadron Leader. I was just borrowing it temporarily." Outside the briefing room, a steady stream of RAF personnel found excuses to walk past the window. Word had spread quickly. The legendary Viper was on base, the pilot whose combat record made grown men weep with envy, the woman who had turned the A-10 Thunderbolt II into mythology. Morrison's secure phone rang. He answered on the first ring, listened for several minutes, then hung up with a puzzled expression. "Major, that was interesting. My superiors have just informed me that your mission in the Sinai Peninsula has been retroactively classified as an authorized combat operation under NATO Article 5 provisions." Viper raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Furthermore, I'm instructed to provide you with any assistance necessary while you await transport back to the United States." What Morrison didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that the phone call had come directly from the Prime Minister's office. The British government had been quietly monitoring the situation in the Middle East, watching as their American allies struggled to provide effective close air support without their A-10 fleet. Major Reeves had just demonstrated something that military planners on both sides of the Atlantic were reluctant to admit. Modern warfare still required platforms capable of flying low, slow, and ugly into the teeth of enemy fire. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the Akrotiri flight line, surrounded by curious RAF technicians who marveled at its battle damage. 37 holes from small arms fire, 2 near misses from surface-to-air missiles, and stress fractures from extreme maneuvering. Any other aircraft would have been destroyed. The Warthog had brought its pilot home. Chief Master Sergeant Williams, an RAF armorer with 30 years of experience, ran his hand along the A-10's armored cockpit. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "This thing's built like a flying tank." His colleague, Sergeant Davies, was examining the GAU-A cannon. 7 barrels, 30mm bore, depleted uranium ammunition. No wonder it punches holes through main battle tanks. They'd seen the gun camera footage, classified material that somehow found its way to the flight line. Viper's attack runs were textbook perfect, each one delivered with the kind of precision that took decades to master. The woman hadn't just stolen an aircraft. She'd reminded the world what professional close air support looked like. "Sergeant," Williams said quietly, "I've been working on combat aircraft since the Falklands War. I've never seen anything like this." The next morning brought a convoy of American officials, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes that fooled nobody. They arrived with the grim expressions of people tasked with cleaning up a major diplomatic incident. General Patricia Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle, her face carefully neutral. She'd flown halfway around the world to personally handle the Reeves situation, partly because of the diplomatic implications, partly because She needed to understand how one of her former pilots had just embarrassed the entire Air Force. Major Reeves snapped to attention as the general approached. Despite everything, the stolen aircraft, the unauthorized mission, the international incident, military protocol still mattered. Major Cassandra, Reeves reporting, ma'am. General Hayes returned the salute, then studied the woman who had just turned military aviation doctrine upside down. Viper looked exactly like what she was, a combat pilot who had pushed herself and her aircraft beyond all reasonable limits to accomplish an impossible mission. Major Hayes said quietly, "We need to talk." The conversation that followed would determine whether Major Cassandra Reeves faced court-martial for theft and insubordination, or whether the United States Air Force was ready to admit that retiring the A-10 fleet had been a catastrophic mistake. Either way, the woman they'd called obsolete had just changed the future of American close air support forever. The secure conference room at RAF Akrotiri had been hastily cleared of British personnel, leaving only General Hayes and Major Reeves facing each other across a steel table. Between them lay classified folders containing damage assessments, casualty reports, and diplomatic cables that would reshape military aviation policy. "Cassie," General Hayes said, using the familiar name she'd known for 15 years, "what the hell were you thinking?" Major Reeves met her superior's gaze without flinching. "I was thinking that 200 American civilians were about to die because we no longer had the right aircraft for the mission, ma'am. So you decided to steal a decommissioned A-10 and fly it into combat without authorization. I decided to use available resources to save American lives." General Hayes opened the first folder. Satellite imagery showed the aftermath of Viper's attack: 12 destroyed enemy vehicles, scattered armor formations, and clear evacuation routes for the trapped civilians. The tactical situation that had seemed hopeless had been resolved in 18 minutes by a single pilot in an aircraft that Congress had deemed obsolete. "The President wants to court-martial you," Hayes said quietly. "I understand, ma'am. The Secretary of Defense wants to give you the Medal of Honor." Viper's expression didn't change. "I was just doing my job, General." "No, Cassie, you were doing the job we should have been doing all along." The admission hung in the air between them. General Hayes had been one of the architects of the A-10 retirement program, convinced that modern warfare required stealth and sophistication over the brute force effectiveness of close air support. The Sinai Peninsula had proved her wrong in the most public way possible. "The Joint Chiefs are meeting tomorrow morning," Hayes continued. "They're going to discuss whether to reactivate the A-10 program." "And what's your recommendation, ma'am?" General Hayes closed the folder. Outside the window, she could see the stolen Thunderbolt II surrounded by technicians who were preparing it for the flight back to America. The aircraft looked exactly like what it was: a machine built for war, designed to absorb punishment and deliver precise death to anyone who threatened American interests. "My recommendation," she said slowly, "is that Major Cassandra Reeves be promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and assigned as commander of the reactivated 355th Fighter Squadron, flying A-10 Thunderbolt IIs in support of ground operations worldwide." Viper's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her professional composure. "Ma'am, I thought the Warthog program was dead." "It was, until you brought it back to life." The phone call to the Pentagon took exactly 17 minutes. General Hayes spoke directly to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed the future of close air support. The decision was unanimous. The A-10 Thunderbolt II would return to active service. Within hours, orders went out to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. The 36 remaining A-10s would be pulled from storage and returned to flight status. Retired pilots would be recalled to active duty. Maintenance crews would be retrained on systems they thought they'd never see again. The Warthog was coming home. But the real victory belonged to Major, soon-to-be Lieutenant Colonel, Cassandra Reeves. The woman they dismissed as obsolete had just proved that some kinds of warfare never go out of style. The pilot who had been forced into retirement 18 months ago would now lead the program she'd risked everything to save. "Cassie," General Hayes said as they prepared to leave the briefing room, "there's one more thing." "Yes, ma'am." "The aircraft you stole, Reaper 6, it's being assigned permanently to your command. Seems appropriate, considering you're the only pilot who's ever flown it across an ocean and into combat." Viper smiled for the first time since landing at Akrotiri. "Thank you, ma'am. Reaper 6 and I have some unfinished business with close air support." The stolen A-10 had become the cornerstone of a resurrected program. The forgotten pilot had become the savior of American close air support. And somewhere in the Pentagon's deepest planning rooms, military strategists were quietly acknowledging what Major Cassandra Reeves had always known. Wars are won by people who fly low, hit hard, and never give up. 6 months after the Sinai Peninsula incident, the 355th Fighter Squadron stood at full strength on the flight line at Fairchild Air Force Base. 24 A-10 Thunderbolt IIs gleamed in the Washington morning sun, their shark-tooth nose art freshly painted and their weapons systems fully operational. Lieutenant Colonel Cassandra "Viper" Reeves walked the line with the pride of someone who had brought the dead back to life. Each aircraft represented a victory over bureaucracy, politics, and the dangerous belief that modern warfare had evolved beyond the need for close air support. "Colonel," Captain Martinez called out, approaching with a maintenance clipboard, "Reaper 6 is mission ready. All systems check out green." Viper nodded, running her hand along the familiar contours of the aircraft that had carried her across an ocean and into legend. The A-10 bore new scars from training missions and exercises, but its essential character remained unchanged. Ugly, ungainly, and absolutely lethal to anyone who threatened American ground forces. The squadron had been rebuilt around pilots who understood the A-10's unique capabilities. Veterans recalled from retirement, younger officers trained on the Thunderbolt's unforgiving systems, and a corps of experienced aviators who had never stopped believing in the Warthog's mission. Major Sandra "Hawk" Williams had been flying F-16s when the call came. Now she stood beside her assigned, marveling at the difference between air-to-air combat and close air support. "It's like comparing a scalpel to a sledgehammer," she told her husband. "Both have their place, but when you need something destroyed completely, you call the Warthog." The squadron's deployment orders had arrived that morning. Immediate transfer to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, with combat missions in support of special operations forces throughout the Middle East. The kind of low-intensity, high-precision operations that had made the A-10 famous during Operation Enduring Freedom. "Listen up," Viper called out, gathering her pilots around the nose of Reaper 6. "Intel reports increased enemy activity in 3 separate theaters. Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan all have American ground forces in contact with hostiles. F-35s and F-22s are handling the high-altitude missions. We're going to take care of everything below 10,000 feet." The pilots nodded with professional understanding. Close air support was dangerous, demanding work that required split-second decisions and perfect coordination with ground forces. Mistakes killed friendly troops. Hesitation got pilots shot down. "The brass is watching us," Viper continued. 6 months ago, they thought the A-10 was finished. Today, we're the most requested air asset in the theater. Every ground commander wants Warthogs on station because they know we'll show up, we'll stay until the job is done, and we'll put ordnance exactly where it needs to go. Captain Thompson, a former Navy pilot transitioning to close air support, raised his hand. "Colonel, What's the biggest difference between flying off carriers and flying warthogs? Viper smiled. Carrier aviation is about precision and timing. A-10 operations are about violence and persistence. When Marines are pinned down by enemy fire, they don't want elegant solutions. They want something that can fly through hell and destroy everything that's shooting at them. The squadron's first mission brief came that afternoon. Intelligence had identified a high-value target in northern Syria, a terrorist training camp protected by sophisticated anti-aircraft systems. F-35s had attempted bombing runs, but the combination of civilian structures and mobile surface-to-air missiles made high-altitude attacks impractical. The target requires close air support, the intelligence officer explained. Low-altitude approaches, precision targeting, and the ability to loiter over the area for extended periods. Every pilot in the room understood the implications. This was exactly the kind of mission that had justified the A-10's existence for 30 years, and exactly the kind of mission that the Air Force had claimed was no longer necessary in modern warfare. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves stood at the front of the briefing room, studying the target photographs with the intensity that had made her legendary. The terrorist camp was built into rocky terrain that would mask radar signatures and complicate targeting solutions. Standard bombing runs would cause massive collateral damage. Missile strikes might miss entirely. But an A-10 could fly low enough to identify individual targets, accurate enough to destroy specific buildings, and tough enough to survive the inevitable ground fire. Mission parameters, Viper announced. Four-ship formation, mixed loadout of 30 and AGM-65 Mavericks. Primary objective is destruction of the training facilities. Secondary objective is elimination of anti-aircraft threats to enable follow-on operations. The pilots leaned forward, absorbing tactical details that would determine success or failure. Approach routes, communication frequencies.